We're going to be looking at many passages in the book of Acts. We're going to kind of round out now after, how long has it been? A year and a half, I guess. The political section of the intertestamental period will be into the bottom half of the third page, starting next week then. We're going to finish these last three men, not in this order, but Herod Agrippa II, I'm looking on the top half of page 3, and Felix and Festus. I just put the two Herod Agrippas together there, but really Herod Agrippa II will come down at the bottom. He'll be number 9, Felix number 7, and Festus number 8. So, and before I get that far, we skip the first 4 prefects because they were not very important. We looked at Pontius Pilate, the 5th one. We spent most of our time with him. We skipped the next couple because they weren't important, and we wanted to get down to why we had a break in the dates that I gave you on the prefects from 41 to 44. That's because of the fact they don't have prefects. They go back to an older system of the kings in the country. And then with the death of the king Agrippa I, his son Agrippa II is only 17. He's too young to take over. We'll explain more about that later. And so Rome reverts back in AD 44 to the system of the prefects, these being Roman men, the Herods being at least part Jewish men. So after the time of Herod Agrippa I, our first prefect, I'm going to say a few things about the next 3 prefects. Then we'll have Felix and Festus. And then we'll skip the last 2, which would be numbers 13 and 14 on your list because they're not important. Cuspicius Fadus. This is back to your list of prefects. Cuspicius Fadus, he ought to be like number 8, I think. He ruled from AD 44 to AD 46. Josephus gives an account of how during his rule a man by the name of Theudas, Theudas, led a group of men out to the Jordan River, promising that he would part the waters just like a Joshua or like an Elijah had done before. And Fadus sent his cavalry out after this man, Theudas, and the people that had gathered with him, dispersed the men, and returned back to Caesarea with the head of Theudas. Now, the reason I'm mentioning that is it's given historians problems, because Luke mentions a Theudas who was an insurgent, a rebel, in Acts chapter 5 and verse 36. This comes out in the speech of Gamaliel in Acts 5 and verse 36. And of course, the problem that it gives historians of Scripture is one of a chronological nature. Notice the dates for Cuspicius Fadus, AD 44 to 46. During his reign, we're indebted to Josephus for this. This man named Theudas goes out and says that he's going to part the Jordan River. Of course, he's probably got, Old Testament notions in his mind, a new people of God being birthed. Like, we don't know whether he's trying to be a Joshua or trying to be Elijah. We know both of those men did part the Jordan River in the Old Testament, but particularly trying to be a Joshua, a new people of God, new as opposed to these Jews who have so basely subjected themselves for so long to their Roman overlords. The new people of God are on the rise, and Theudas, of course, is going to be this new messianic or quasi-messianic leader of them. In Acts 5, in Gamaliel's speech, we read, "For before these days," so I guess that's dating it for us, "for before these days rose up Theudas, boasting himself to be somebody," Theudas, "to whom a number of men, about 400, joined themselves, who was slain." We know that Fadus sent his cavalry out after them, and the head of Theudas was brought back to Caesarea. So the man was slain. And all, and this would be the result of his death, all as many as obeyed him were scattered and brought to naught. Well, of course, the problem is one of dating. Acts chapter 5 would have to be back in the beginning of the 4th decade, in the early 30s. And we're way up into the middle of the 5th decade, 44 to 46. We'll take the middle 3 years out of the 5th decade. So we're either 15 years late or 15 years early, depending on which way you look at it. So the only explanation we have is there must have been 2 of these men, and of course the critics pull their hair out over that because the cases seem to be too similar, to be 2 different men, 2 insurgents, 2 rebels, 2 Jews who lead a certain group of Jews. Evidently, we're to suppose this from both accounts, both Luke's account in Acts 5 and that of Josephus in his writings. They led a group of Jewish men probably in some type of revolt against the Romans. Both of them end up dead, one by beheading, decapitation, as Josephus tells us. We're not told how here by Luke, just that he who was slain, he was slain, and all as many as obeyed him were scattered and brought to naught. Since Luke goes on, and this he's just recording the speech of Gamaliel. That's always one way out of it. We could say Gamaliel was wrong. And many times the scripture authors, they don't intend for us to believe everything they say was correct or right or biblically or scripturally okay, but they're just recording what someone else said. But that doesn't seem to be the case. Gamaliel would know what he's talking about. He's living during that time. He just says, for before these days, it's sometime before the time of Gamaliel, sometime before the trial of the apostles here. There's second one. Now, they've been tried back in chapter 4 and let go, and tried this time, imprisoned, and now threatened, and then finally beaten down in verse 40. But he would know what's going on. The end of the 3rd decade, the 20s, the beginning of the 4th decade, the 30s AD. He would know what took place prior to his time, and probably not that many years prior to his time, not like it's 500 years earlier or something. But as I was going to say, the order that's given is interesting because, first of all, he gives us the case of Theudas, and then he gives us in verse 37, a verse that we should be very familiar with by now. After this man rose up Judas of Galilee in the days of the taxing. Well, what year was that when all of this, verse 37, took place? AD 6. AD 6. After this man rose up Judas of Galilee in the days of the taxing and drew away much people after him. He also perished, and all, even as many as obeyed him, were dispersed. Notice the emphasis is kind of on obedience there. In verse 36, those that obeyed, those that believed or obeyed. Those that obeyed in verse 37. Because the apostles had just said in verse 29, we ought to obey God rather than men. Gamaliel has wise, wait-and-see, patient exhortation here. Let's just watch and see whether these people's obedience bring them anything after all. Therefore, if we're going to take the speech of Gamaliel and Luke's recording of it to have any historical value at all, and of course we do take it that way, then if we date Judas of Galilee AD 6, we have to date Theudas sometime prior to that, which means he comes a half a century prior to this second Theudas that's mentioned by Josephus. And there's nothing inherently improbable about that. It was a common name. 2 people could have been named that. We're going to see later on in our study tonight. Also from the writings of Josephus, he reports during this time, 1st century AD, particularly beginning with the 4th decade or the 5th decade onwardly, many messianic pretenders arose. I think Jesus prophesied that also. He said that many would rise and say that I am the Messiah. And Josephus said that's exactly what happened in the 1st century. Many arose right after Jesus prophesied that. Probably, if we're going to take anything, we would probably date this man Theudas in Acts back as early as 4 BC. Why? Because remember all of the tumult surrounding the death of Herod the Great. Prime time to revolt. So this Theudas may have been one of the many, and we know also from Josephus' writings that many led some type of revolts during this period of time. And this Theudas of Acts 5 and verse 36 may have been one of those many. So I just give you that because you'll come across that in your readings that there's a discrepancy between Luke and Josephus. And there's only a discrepancy if we insist on these 2 men being the self-same individual, and there's no compelling evidence to cause us to do that. So we have one Theudas, maybe as early as 4 BC, and then after him, we read in verse 37, after this man, 10 years later, another man rose up, Judas of Galilee. And he's concerned, of course, about the tax that's been levied. So that's the important event that takes place during the reign of Festus. Then the next prefect is Tiberius Alexander. Number 9 is Tiberius Alexander, who rules from 46 to 48. He was the son of an important Jewish family in Alexandria. See, the first 4 I skipped over because there's really not much to say about them. Neither will there be anything to say about the last 2, really. 5 is the most important. 11 and 12, Felix and Festus, come behind that. And then numbers 8, 9, and 10, Festus, Alexander, and Cumanus also have something that could be said of them. And Alexander, the reason I'm mentioning him is he also was a nephew to Philo, the Jewish philosopher in Alexandria. And of course, what I want you to see interesting about this man is that he is a Jew. Almost all these people are Romans that we're talking about. They're coming onto the scene of Jewish affairs, coming from Rome, being from a different train of thought and a different background. And here's a man who is a Jew, a son of an important Jewish family down in Alexandria. He would have to be if he's connected in any way, and he is, as the nephew to Philo. But he's no good as a Jew. He's an apostate, so he fits right in with his Roman cohorts, Pontius Pilate and Felix and Festus. He put down a revolt in these 2 years of his reign. He put down a revolt of the 2 sons of the Acts 5 Judas. We just happen to be back with this little passage. That's why we have to know something about these verses, 36 and 37 of Acts 5, because they are important and it's always coming out in history somewhere. And the 2 sons' names were James and Simon. James and Simon. Tiberius Alexander, around AD 47, puts down a revolt of these 2 men, James and Simon, who are sons of Judas of Galilee, Acts 5:37. And he has both of these men crucified, practicing, of course, a Roman form of punishment. Never was it a Jewish form. They might impale someone, but it was never crucifixion, though. Impalement would always follow death. And then number 10, Cumanus, the next prefect, 48 to 52. 48 to 52. Very disruptive period. Tensions beginning to run high. Many problems between the Jews and the occupying Roman soldiers. One case in point, a Roman soldier burned a synagogue scroll. And the Jews just about went berserk over this. And they went to Caesarea to protest the matter. And they just refused to give up. Remember, they had gone to protest the matters before Pontius Pilate, and even laid down and bared their necks if Pilate wanted to kill them. Pilate finally had to give in concerning the emblems of the emperor being brought into Jerusalem. They just would not give up until Cumanus had the soldier, who was a Roman, and Cumanus was a Roman, executed. And I give that to you just to show the fairness of the Roman Empire. Of course, in opposition to the fairness of Jesus' trial before Pontius Pilate. Here Cumanus, because the soldier was in the wrong. They did not have the right to go around burning synagogue scrolls that belonged to the Jews. That just caused more problems for the Romans in this Jewish territory as they were occupying it. So it shows the fairness of the empire, since Israel's religion, just like so many of the other conquered peoples by Rome, their religion was protected by law. Okay, we just want to quickly do those 3. Now we come into our 11th one that we'll spend a lot of time on, most of our time probably this evening, and that is Antonius Felix. Antonius Felix rules from AD 52 to 59. Here's where we will need here in a moment our genealogy and the book of Acts particularly, because that's where these men are seen. Never over in the Gospels. That's too early. That's Pontius Pilate time. Felix and Festus, of course, are in the book of Acts. Antonius Felix. He had held a post in Samaria under Cumanus, whenever Cumanus was still prefect from 48 to 52. Once Cumanus was dismissed by the Roman emperor in 52, then Felix was elevated from his inferior post in Samaria to being prefect of Judea. He was the only non-equestrian prefect of these 14 in the first half of the 1st century A.D. in Palestine. Remember, I said that the prefects were drawn from the equestrian order of Roman society. He was a freed man, which meant he formerly was a slave. He really worked his way up, and how he did that I will tell you in just a moment. He was a former slave of the emperor's wife, as a matter of fact. The only non-equestrian. All the rest of these men, the other 13, are drawn from the equestrian order of Roman society. He was the only freedman, a former slave. What type of individual was he? Well, his portrayals in history are not the most flattering. Tacitus, in Annals 12:54, said of Felix, quote, "He thought he could do any evil act with impunity." He was thought of then as an evil man by more or less his contemporaries, Roman contemporaries. Tacitus, in his Annals 12:54, said Felix thought he could do any evil act with impunity. And then he has an interesting comment in his Histories 5:9. Maybe a play on the former status of Felix. Histories 5:9. Tacitus said, "Felix exercised the power of a king in the spirit of a slave." We have to know something about his character to read that into, as it were, the few chapters in the book of Acts where he's seen. Like chapters 22 through 24. Histories 5:9, Tacitus records, "Felix exercised the power of a king in the spirit of a slave." So he's a freed man, a former slave, a slave of the emperor's wife, of the non-equestrian order or orders of Roman society. He's not portrayed in a very flattering manner, even by contemporaries, even by Roman contemporaries. So how did he end up with the position that he had? Basically, he got it through marriage. In marriage, he was able to move himself up a bit in society. For instance, one wife of his, that means he had a few of them, one wife was a descendant of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. This is a slave that had a wife that descended from Mark Antony and Cleopatra. That's nice pedigree. That's nice prestige there. Another wife, and this was his most important wife because this was his wife that brought him into Jewish affairs, that really prepared him for Jewish affairs, was Drusilla. Remember her name in the book of Acts? Drusilla. Go with me to your genealogy. We're going to be through using this evening, so be sure to get good use out of it your final night. Thank God we don't have to go over all of those names right under Herod again. We've already done that. Only one important is his second wife, Mariamne, granddaughter of Hyrcanus. Her important child, Aristobulus, marries a woman named Berenice. And then all on the bottom left of your chart, all of these are descendants of Herod and Mariamne through Aristobulus. Okay, we see Aristobulus has a son, Herod, has a son, Aristobulus, has a son, Agrippa the First, has a daughter, Herodias. Do you know the connections of Herodias? Married Herod Philip, divorced and had Salome by him, then married Herod Antipas, tetrarch of Galilee and Perea, and that's where John the Baptist enters the picture. We'll come back to that Herod who married a woman by the name of Mariamne, and then who later married a woman by the name of Bernice, or connections there. It was a marriage, but interesting situation how that works out. Aristobulus is not important. Agrippa the First. He was our topic last time, remember, Agrippa the First. Part Jew now. All of these people have Jewish blood in them. Try to keep that in your mind versus the Roman nature of the prefects, although we just talked about one Jewish one, Tiberius Alexander. For the most part, the others are Romans. Okay, he has the following children: Agrippa, Drusus, Berenice, Mariamne, Drusilla. So Drusilla is the daughter of Agrippa the First. That's the King Agrippa of Acts chapter 12. And he was the king from AD 41 to 44. He was the king that put James the apostle to death with the sword, the one that imprisoned Peter, the one who moved the capital from Caesarea down to Jerusalem, the one who went up to Caesarea one time, gave a speech, and they shouted, "It's the voice of a God, not of a man," and he died. We read all of that from Luke and from Josephus last time. So she is a descendant, and these will be many important descendants. For instance, we'll be looking at Agrippa II here later on, as well as Berenice, another daughter of Agrippa I. But anyway, Drusilla. Now, Drusilla, first of all, was married to Azizus, A-Z-I-Z-U-S. This is all for you there on your chart. Drusilla was first of all married to Azizus when she was 15. And he was king of Emesa, which was a city up in Syria. According to Luke's account, she's a Jewess. We'll read that later on in the book of Acts. He calls her a Jewess. Well, she certainly is. Contrary to her husband Felix now. He's a Roman, former slave. But she is a Jewess. Why? Not through Herod. Herod's not a Jew. But through Mariamne, who was a granddaughter of Aristobulus II and of Hyrcanus II. So she has Jewish blood, although it's rather distant, we might add. I guess she could be called a Jewess because she has Jewish blood in her. She was born in AD 38. Drusilla was born in AD 38. And after her leaving of Azizus, she marries Felix in AD 54, whenever she's 16. Felix has now been prefect for 2 years. Prefect for 2 years. And he has the majority of his prefectship left. So she does give him good preparation for at least the future years that he will be prefect in Palestine. They had a son. So Drusilla, this is all for you on your genealogy. First of all, married to Azizus, then to Felix. Now, Felix won't appear anywhere else on the chart because he's not a descendant now of Herod. The Agrippas are, Agrippa 1 and 2, but not Pontius Pilate or Felix or Festus. They have a son by the name of Agrippa. And just a historical note here, both Agrippa and his mother Drusilla, the Drusilla of the book of Acts, both of them perished in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in AD 79. We've discussed that somewhere in our studies, I'm sure. I think it was way back in creation in the old building. Someone was asking some questions about volcanoes or something. We discussed the eruption of Mount Vesuvius and how it wiped out a few cities like Pompeii. In AD 79, that brings about the end to both her and him. Okay, before I go any further into the biblical account, that's what we want to major on with Felix, let's start with something a term that maybe you have come across in your readings before, the Sicarii, and just who these people are. They do figure into the New Testament on one occasion, definitely, maybe 2, maybe even 3 occasions, but according to Josephus, they definitely do figure into the time of Antonius Felix, the Sicarii. Let me spell it. Maybe you have not known how to pronounce it. And you've seen that term before. Sicarii, the Sicarii. The Sicarii. If you will turn over to, have you ever seen that word before? No, not too many of you have. If you turn over to Acts chapter 21, we're going to be starting here in a moment. Comes from the Greek term Sikarioi. You'll see it in the New Testament as Sikarion. It will appear one time in the New Testament in this form, Sikarion, longo. This term comes from this term, which is a Greek loan word. Loan word, that means it's borrowed, which comes from Latin term, S-I-C-A, which means a dagger. Okay, you have to get all of that down. Sicarii, to show you some pronunciations there on it. The Sicarii come from the Sikarioi, which is a Greek loan word from a Latin term, S-I-C-A, which means dagger. It will appear in the plural over in Acts 21 as Sikarion. And what it means, dagger, so we can't just say plural daggers, because it refers to a group of people that were on the loose during the time of the Apostle Paul, during the time of Antonius Felix, that played a very major, significant role in Israel's history just prior to the downfall of the nation from A.D. 66 to A.D. 70. It's translated many, many different ways. I think in the King James it's given to us as murderers. I think in the NIV it's given to us as terrorists. Better translations will give us this term. And the literal meaning, going back to the Latin, would be something like this. Murderers, terrorists, assassins. Because assassins is exactly what they were. Okay, let's talk about the Sicarii. I'm surprised none of you have seen that term written in some literature that you've read. The Sicarii. During Felix's rule in Caesarea, a group of Jewish assassins were on the loose, generally just referred to as either assassins or the dagger men, because of their weapon, obviously. Long knife or short sword, halfway in between the dagger. They would mingle in crowds carrying a concealed dagger. According to Josephus, Antiquities 28:5, 20:20. Antiquities 28:5, as well as 10:5 and 10. To murder various people, such as Jews with pro-Roman sympathies. And Felix was a man who helped to bring this group to a halt. They're important because they'll figure into the New Testament here in just a moment. The Sicarii. Antiquities 28:5. There are in other places as well, like in Jewish wars. 28:5 and 28:10. The assassins, the dagger men. Now here's the most significant, the most important, the best known story about the Sicarii. One Egyptian Jew in A.D. 54, that's the same time Felix is marrying Drusilla, and that's about 2 years into his rule. An Egyptian Jew who was part of the Sicarii in A.D. 54, claiming to be a prophet, by the way, led 4,000 men Remember how we've seen two accounts of men now in Acts 5, one Theudas, one Judas of Galilee, leading men out for some reason. The Jews were notoriously rebellious against the Romans. Not all of them were messianic pretenders, but as time went on and as the conclusion of the Jewish nation loomed upon the horizon, more and more of them became just that, messianic pretenders. This Egyptian Jew led 4,000 men out to the Mount of Olives, just east of Jerusalem, announcing that the walls of Jerusalem were going to fall flat, just like those of Jericho did in days of old, so that the Jews could take the city from the Romans. Really all you would need would be the walls of Antonia to fall flat, but he was looking for a bigger, spectacular event here. So the walls of the city were going to fall flat, just like they did at Jericho. And they were going to take the city away from the Romans. This is a group, 4,000 of the Sicarii. Felix sent his cavalry out after them. 400 were killed. 200 were captured. But the Egyptian Jewish leader vanished. I don't mean into thin air. He escaped. Josephus mentions this in Jewish War 2:13-4. And it's in this context, either 2:13-4 or 2:13-3, one or the other. If you read both of them, you'll get both of these things, both the account of this leader of a group of the Sicarii, as well as his statement that during this time a whole host of messianic pretenders were on the scene. If you'll turn over to, that's Jewish War 2:13-4. If you'll turn over to, trying to think of the best, well, we'll do Matthew 24 since it's the better known of the chapters. Matthew chapter 24. The statement of Josephus, maybe we'll use this, I'm sure we will use it sometime in the future for studies of Matthew 24 or studies of, well, I guess studies of Matthew 24 or the parallel chapters 13 and 21 in Mark and Luke respectively, to help us interpret the time context for what Jesus is saying, or the multiple time contexts for what Jesus is saying. Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, See not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. It's a prophecy of the destruction of the temple. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, as he sat on the Mount of Olives, see the connection there? The Egyptian Jew leads these men to the Mount of Olives. The disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be? Now here's the whole problem with Matthew 24. How many questions do we have? Is the second one and the third one just an elaboration of the first one, or do the disciples even know what they're asking? Tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming, and what shall be the sign of the end of the world? That's the crux of the interpretation problems of Matthew 24. We have to know what the question is to know what the answer is. We know Jesus goes on to say, take heed and watch out for this, and the gospel's going to be preached, and immediately after the tribulation in those days. Well, is it the tribulation of the fall of the city in AD 70? Or is it as most evangelicals today take it, especially those in a dispensational framework of theology? This is what we would call, quote, end-time prophecy, end of quote. Well, it kind of depends on how many questions the disciples asked, and did Jesus answer one or more? And if he answered more, in what order did he answer those questions? Can you not see that there is at least a possibility? We're not getting into this. I just do these things all the time to let you know that there's diversity of opinion so that you're not bullheaded about something that you don't know anything about. You know, we all regret that when we look back. We were bullheaded on something we didn't have the slightest notion what we were speaking of. So at least that makes you tread the waters carefully then. Can we not have, do you not see, more than one question? Tell us, when shall these things be? Okay, what are the things? Well, I guess that'd be verse 2. Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. He's prophesying the destruction of the temple. Okay, you say, well, tell us when shall these things be? And then aren't we to understand that first question, though, you might ask, or a dispensationalist might ask, in light of this next one question, or really to me it looks like two questions, what shall be the sign of thy coming? What shall be the sign of the end of the world? You say, now, well, you could have twofold, because aren't the Jews supposed to rebuild their temple? And so maybe the apostles were asking this question, tell us when shall these things be, the destruction of the temple, thinking that Jesus had some immediate reference or immediate prophecy fulfillment in mind, whereas he didn't. He was really thinking of the temple to still be built in Israel today, its destruction, and therefore we don't have more than one question, therefore we only have one question here. Following what I'm thinking here, how many temples, how many destructions, which destruction was Jesus prophesying here in verse 2, and to which destruction would the apostles have reference? Tell us when shall these things be. Seems like they're thinking of end times, though. Because why do they then just jump right to, and what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? Well, anyway, and Jesus answered and said unto them, take heed that no man deceive you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. And he goes on prophesying about the wars. He prophesies in verse 15, the desolation of the temple. We know that happened during Roman times. And look at verse 16, beginning with verse 16. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. Neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. Why didn't he say, and if you're at the factory, at the General Motors factory in Tel Aviv, then head straight out for the mountains and don't go home in your car. I mean, if he's talking about our day and time, it's this field, housetop. What are you going to be doing up on top of your roof in the 20th century? The first century, maybe that's the place to go. You can catch a cool breeze up there. Woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. I've had questions. I remember one very vivid question. I remember it vividly as well. Someone was really worried about this passage. Wow, if we're living in the last days, and Jesus said almost that we shouldn't be having children because it's going to be so difficult to have children and have all of this take place, because he said it's a woe. And pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. Well, how can that affect Christians? We don't have Sabbath days anymore. The Sabbath was abolished, Colossians 2. First century, before the Jews and before the fall of their city, they had a Sabbath day very definitely. And then he goes on to say in verse 34, verily I say unto you, this generation, which one? The one in which he was living. This generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Well, they could have lived from, let's say, AD 30 to AD 70, 40 years. They would have lived to see just what he prophesies here, the fall of the city and the dispersion of the people to the mountains and ultimately to the four corners, as it were, of the globe. Well, anyway, I do believe that there is much in this prophecy that has reference not to today but to the first century. But all I want to call your attention to right now, I have to say that I believe that, or then this verse won't make any sense at all, is verse 5. Well, really verses 4 and 5. Because of this statement in Josephus, he said that there were many messianic pretenders. What date are we talking about? AD 54. Take heed that no man deceive you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ. That just means the anointed one. Just another term for Messiah, just the Greek term for the Messiah. And shall deceive many. Well, this Egyptian Jew deceived many. That's 4,000. I think that's many. He deceived many. So it's a very interesting parallel. That's what I'm trying to point out to you right now. It's a very interesting parallel between what Josephus recorded as being true to life during a time just prior to when he's writing, and what Jesus had prophesied that came about just a little bit after Jesus prophesied. Matthew 24:5. Many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. When you connect that with verse 34, verily I say unto you, this one, shall not pass till all things be fulfilled. Well, you find that interesting? See, that makes some of you think about things. Some of you are more knowledgeable about various things, and you start thinking about more things. Okay, going back to the book of Acts. I'm still on the subject of this Sicarii. A few years after this Egyptian Jew in AD 54 led these people out, a few years later, when the chief captain of the fortress of Antonia broke up a riot near the temple and rescued a man from death, he thought this foreign-born Jew was this Egyptian leader of this Sicarii. Oh, he was a foreign-born Jew born in Tarsus, but it was the Apostle Paul. If you look in Acts 21, verses 30 through 39. All the city was moved. And the people ran together, and they took Paul and drew him out of the temple, and forthwith the doors were shut. And as they went about to kill him, tidings came unto the chief captain of the cohort that all Jerusalem was in an uproar. Band, the technical term is cohort. Band just means a group of 600 more or less men. 600, remember, stationed under this chief captain in Antonia, who immediately took soldiers and centurions, you'd have to have at least 6 of those if you have 600 men, and ran down unto them. And when they saw the chief captain and the soldiers, they left beating of Paul. Then the chief captain, we find out later his name is Claudius Lysias, came near and took him and commanded him to be bound with 2 chains, and demanded who he was and what he had done. And some cried one thing and some another among the multitude. And when he could not know the certainty for the tumult, he commanded him to be carried into the fortress. It wasn't a medieval castle, it was just a fortress. When he came upon the stairs, so it was that he was borne of the soldiers for the violence of the people. For the multitude of the people followed after, crying, Away with him. And as Paul was to be led into the fortress, he said unto the chief captain, May I speak unto thee? Who said, Canst thou speak Greek? He must have been speaking Greek when he asked the question. And look at this question. Art not thou that Egyptian, which before these days, just a few years prior to this, madest an uproar and led us out into the wilderness 4,000 men, which were Sicarion, is the Greek term here. Translated murderers, that's okay, but assassins would be better. Or dagger men, if you want to see the Latin etymology of our term assassins in this context. Now, how do you like that? A direct parallel, again, between Luke and the biblical narrative here and what Josephus had to say. Josephus gives quite a bit of information about this Egyptian Jew. Art not thou that Egyptian which before these days made us an uproar, led us out into the wilderness, 4,000 men? And he tells us there were 4,000 men, 400 killed, 200 captured. The Egyptian escaped. And so Claudius Lysias, this has only happened like, about 3 years, let's say. About 3 years prior, 2 to 3 years prior to what's taking place here in Acts 21. Maybe I need to give that to you. So we're dating Acts 21 like around 56 to 57 A.D. So only 2 to 3 years prior, in 54, this happened. And Claudius Lysias must have been the man who was sent out with his soldiers, with the cavalry that he also would have been in control of, that was sent out from Antonia. That was the nearest place, because the prefect, Felix, would be all the way up in Caesarea. After Agrippa I passes off the scene, they moved capital from Jerusalem back to Caesarea, where it should have been all along. So, you see, he missed this man. This man escaped, and he's probably been looking for this man, thinking about this man the whole time, and now he sees another riot. And all these Jews are all upset over this one individual here, and it's in Jerusalem, and it's in the precincts of the temple, and so the only thing he can think of is he's got this Egyptian fellow finally, this leader of the Sicarii. He's got this fellow finally. He's going to execute him because he escaped earlier. So he's surprised when he asks this question. Can thou speak Greek? Aren't you that Egyptian? And he goes on and gives us the very account that Josephus gives us. Of course, Paul says, no, I'm a man which am a Jew of Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, not from Egypt, but from Cilicia, a citizen of no mean or unimportant city, and I beseech thee, suffer me to speak unto the people. When he had given him license, and Paul stood on the stairs and beckoned with the hand unto the people, when there was made a great silence, and he spake unto them, probably in the Aramaic tongue, saying, only chapter in the Bible with a comma, you remember, men, brethren, fathers, hear my defense. The NIV gives terrorists. Well, maybe that was okay prior to what, the 1975s up until now? Now we know what terrorists are. They're Arabs, as my wife always called them. They're Arabs. They always are riding on airplanes. And they didn't have airplanes back then, and these guys weren't Arabs. They were Jews. Terrorist is not that good of a word. Assassin is definitely the best term. They were assassins. Remember I said they would mingle in crowds carrying a concealed dagger under their cloak and assassinate Roman people, but particularly Jewish people who had pro-Roman sympathies. And so Felix is the one helping to round this group up and stop these people. So if you've never known anything about the Sicarii, maybe you didn't even know the Sicarii existed, now you know something. And that term, if you look it up in the Greek, is the term behind this word, the last word in verse 38, murderers. It's the term behind that, which would probably better be translated assassins. Although if you murder someone, if you assassinate someone, you're a murderer, there's no doubt about that. But they were assassins, Jewish assassins. And notice how many this one Egyptian Jew had, 4,000 behind him.
For the